Hi.
Hi, Lara, Dr. Lara. Thank you so much for joining us. I am just getting ready my documents here, and we will get going. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We are going to start in just a few minutes, or even a minute or so. All right, so before we start, this webinar will be recorded. If you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A spot. It's at the bottom of the of the chat box there, and we will try to get to all the questions. But we have had questions submitted beforehand, so we're going to address those first. If we have time, we'll definitely incorporate yours or ask them flat, up front. First, I also would like to acknowledge, particularly during Native American Heritage Month, that I am currently on the ancestral and unceded territory and traditional lands of the Manahawk people, and I pay my respect to elders both past and present. I would also ask that we take a moment of reflection in silence in honor of Gaza, in honor of Palestine and the Palestinian people, and in honor of the martyrs, political prisoners, and all people struggling for liberation and fighting for justice from Turtle Island to Palestine. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining this ADC series. It's the first of a few, but let me start by introducing ADC. I'm sure many of you know without introduction, but for those of you who don't know, ADC was founded in 1980. The Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee is a civil rights organization committed to defending the rights of people of Arab descent and promoting their rich cultural heritage. And we've seen the unprecedented rise in anti-Palestinian and anti-Arab hate, harassment, intimidation in the past month. And we at ADC have been committed to making sure that the rights of our community are protected, that our voices are heard at the highest level of government as we hold our elected officials accountable, and to be a resource to help empower our communities. So we are here for you. Now it's our turn to discuss mental health, but we are here to support our community in every way we can. So welcome to the first webinar in our Experts on Mental Health series. My name is Zaina Ashrawi-Hutchison, and I'm honored to be hosting this webinar tonight. But I also want to make sure that I mention that while I may be the one on screen, this truly is a collaborative effort, and I want to make sure to mention my incredible colleagues. Thank you to Jasmine Hawamde from ADC, who is the communications director, for her partnership in every aspect of this and more, and to Hala Nu'man, ADC's social media manager, for the wonderful work that she's done on this as well, and everybody else. ADC is such a wonderful team. But while we were populating the new ADC resource page dedicated to embracing wellness and mental health and resource hub, and there's a lot, we'll discuss this a little bit here in a second, but while we were working on this webinar and thinking about ways where we can help the community in this respect, so many questions came to mind. It wasn't a simple, straightforward, here's what we want to do and here's how we're going to do it. But the more research that we did and the more questions that came in, we realized that there was one recurring question and one recurring conversation that was being had, which was, and many of us find it difficult to answer, how are you? A question that casually we usually brush off with a well-practiced, I'm well, thank you, how are you? But despite everything else happening behind the scenes in our lives, we've become so accustomed to saying I'm fine. But now it's different. It's really different. There's something about the question that, given the moment, it is one of the most difficult questions to answer. It throws you into an unforgiving spiral of thought, if you will. There are words, there aren't words really to describe the feelings. And even if there are words, it's impossible to relate them in an answer to the mundane question, how are you doing? Which is customarily intended to sort of elicit a half-syllable response, usually. So it became a loaded question. So while we are here, it became more and more apparent that we all needed guidance and help in understanding and deciphering our own feelings, given the situation, given the genocide in Gaza, given the pain, given the hurt. So we needed to hear from experts addressing the community's specific on mental health concerns in response to the ongoing genocide and the targeted violence across Palestine and political repression here in the United States. So it is with great pleasure and an honor that I introduce our guest, Dr. Lara Sheehi. Dr. Lara is an assistant professor of clinical psychology and founding faculty director of the Psychoanalysis and the Arab World Lab. She is co-author with Stephen Sheehi of Psychoanalysis Under Occupation, Practicing Resistance in Palestine, which won the Middle East Monitor's 2022 Palestine Book Award for Best Academic Book. Dr. Lara is on the advisory board of the USA-Palestine Mental Health Network. There's so much more I could say about Dr. Lara and her expertise and her advocacy and her eloquence, but it is, with no further ado, an honor that I introduce Dr. Lara to you guys. Welcome, Dr. Lara. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Swana. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your wonderful and generous introduction, and also for grounding us with our indigenous siblings in the settler colony of the United States. Hi, everybody. مساء الخير للكل وللجميع. أهلا وسهلا فيكم. And I just want to say thank you to the ADC for their phenomenal work. These folks are showing up every single day for us. They are doing the work. There's so much behind the scenes. For tonight, I want to thank especially Zena, Yasmin, and Hela for all their hard work making this webinar happen. And also a special shout out to Abed and his family, who give all of us so much. The man never rests. I don't think he does. I'll begin tonight with an overview of what brings us today in community, and then I'll move into some of the moving pieces of why so many of us are struggling so much right now. This is the basis of this webinar, of course, and how it came to be. There are some obvious reasons, of course, as we witness the horrifying genocide in Gaza, and yet there are other pieces that are smaller, though crucial and historical, that I hope I can highlight for us. Because of the sheer magnitude of what's happening, my talk likely won't cover everything that's needed, but I hope it will offer us a starting point and importantly allow us to move into the questions that were submitted. And I really want to thank everybody so much for really taking the time to submit such thoughtful questions. I want to name that we as a Swana people, and here it's in a Southwest Asian, North African people, have quite often been accused of not caring about mental health or overly stigmatizing it. While this may be true, and especially for those who've experienced the stigma themselves, I will say here what I say to my Swana students all the time. Our community doesn't singularly own stigma. We don't have to look far in the context of the United States, especially to see how mental health stigma abounds. So it's perhaps less about our community only or alone, and more about ableism, for example, and the concept of what constitutes health. This is an important starting point for us to immediately talk back to the Eurocentric notions that always position us, our community, as lacking before we have even begun. We have over 400 people signed up for this talk today, something that should make us stop and think that our community not only cares about mental health, but really wants to know, even as we are reeling. This is an incredibly important realization for us. I want to also note that if we have not historically found ourselves in the theories, in the methods, in the therapies that are in mainstream psychology, it's because we were never imagined into them to begin with. This can be as simple as an underrepresentation of the particularities of our culture, our traditions, or our kinship relations, or it can look like casual statements meant to be multiculturally sensitive about how we Swana folks, for example, quote, most often show our symptoms physically versus psychologically through backaches or stomach aches or headaches, or we bring our kids to see a psychologist only if they're not doing well in school. As in, we even fail at mental health suffering. I say that partially in humor, but also really to highlight this seemingly innocent messaging, one that writes us out of the story, and one that insists, even unconsciously, that there's a right way to struggle with mental health, and all the rest of the ways are just alternate, compared against the norm, which is almost always white, cis, and hetero. This is the white supremacist view of the world. and it's infused into psychological theory and practice. No wonder why we don't see ourselves in it, and also why this can be used as a defense to not pay attention to mental health issues that, of course, our community deals with. Here I want to invite us all into the actual long and rich history we have had in the Swana region of interrogating issues of al-nafs, what in Arabic refers to simultaneously as psyche, soul, breath, and self. With this in mind, perhaps it's easier to understand why in our community we might feel things physically, why we by and large don't insist on a separation of the physical from the psychic, why we've always had language that describes psychological suffering, and yet why our suffering is still considered non-normative, different, always in relation to whiteness as a norm. I don't mean this to be overly deterministic, but rather just to reclaim our own history, and one that allows us to understand the present and move us toward future healing. With this, I want to move into grounding us further into why this webinar and taking up the issue of mental health in the Swana community is so important, not only in this moment, but always. A grounding can look many ways, but let's take first to the experiential immediately before I get into the psychic particulars, especially for our Swana community. And here I want you to join along with me as you're sitting at home. I want you to scan your body. You don't have to close your eyes. You don't have to do anything particular, but just scan your body. You know yourself from the top of your head down to your toes. Notice the tension you're holding. Is it in your jaw? That's where I hold mine. Is it in your shoulders, in your stomach, in your legs? Are your hands clenched? And as you scan, breathe into those spaces. Feel them relax just a bit. You're in good company, you're in community, even if just for this next hour or so, in the midst of everything that's happening, lean into being in a space of holding, of recognition, of care, of valid pain. And now that you're here in community, let's talk a little bit about why all of this feels so awful. The most pressing, of course, is the genocide we are witnessing in Gaza and the acts of violence across Palestine, in Al-Quds, Jerusalem, in Al-Dakhil, 1948 borders, in Ramallah, in Nablus, in Jenin, everywhere across Palestine from the river to the sea. The fact that these acts happen with impunity, with what seems like no legal or international recourse, can make us feel extremely helpless. This helpless feeling contributes to feeling depleted, feeling alone, and sometimes doubting our own sanity, even when we know full well that what we are seeing is a settler colonial apartheid regime fully backed and supported by the settler colonial state of the United States and their European imperial powers that commit war crimes and enact without shame, without red lines, a full-blown genocide. It is important for our mental health to say this simply and plainly. This is called reality testing. Reality testing is an important exercise because part of what these types of operations do, the full-scale genocide, but also the mainstream media denial, the psychological operations coming from the Israeli occupation forces and the White House, is to try and force us, make us begin to question ourselves, even when we know we are right, even when what is happening is an extension of 75 plus years of settler colonial violence. Reality testing then actively works against this. It might sound overly simple, but the repetition or reality against the insistence to deny, against coercive denial, creates a buffer for our psyche. I've heard the effect of this coercive denial from people who I've spoken to over the past month, and they say a version to me of this. Even when I know for a fact what I am seeing, this is them speaking, I sometimes wonder, am I exaggerating? Am I wrong? Am I crazy? A version or so of this I always hear. This version is of course magnified when censorship is present. So when listservs don't allow the word genocide because it's too provocative, when students are being punished, when social media is being surveilled. This course of denial is what my writing and life partner, Sheehi, and I have called settler colonial reality bending, as in, to live in a world that is dictated by the violence that is needed to sustain settler colonialism, whether that's in Palestine or Turtle Island, in what is now known as United States and Canada, there's a demand that we bend away from the truth constantly, that we bend away from history constantly, from who we know belonged to the lands and what had to be done to displace, dispossess, and disappear them. Because we know this type of coercion happens in a patterned way, I really want to urge us as a starting point, and this really is the place to start for psychological well-being for our community, is to start from a point to remain steadfast in our ability to tell the truth about what is happening within ourselves, to our families, to our children, and to the world. Because here's the other piece that drains us. This is why people feel so awful. Not only are we asked to join in reality bending, but because of real danger, we're also often tasked with filtering ourselves. We double check our emails, our media posts. We look over our shoulder and around us when we're speaking even of benign things. We're made to feel always already guilty. And of course, when you're feeling like this, it comes with the task also of feeling like we have to warn our children to temper themselves down, to not say certain things. These acts of self-policing get inside of us, and we start maybe also policing others around us. This is not only exhausting, but it also is psychologically damaging. I don't mean to shame us when I say this, us as in our community. When people are under duress or tapping into fear, they're more likely to go on lockdown and will often make compromises because the hope is that this type of protective stance will bring in safety. Part of why this current moment is so crushing to so many people that I've spoken to and that I hear about and who reach out to me, why it's so deeply disruptive and for some even traumatizing, is that the lie of that promise, the myth of that safety, especially in the United States, is so deeply clear to so many of us. So in addition to watching the unthinkable happen, in witnessing a twisted inversion of who's oppressed and who does the oppressing, as we bear witness to our siblings suffering in Gaza through their media posts, through their reporting, through their photos that they smuggle out to us, we're also having to organize and metabolize that self-policing we've been pushed into doing to ourselves and to our community, and to recognize that it's not enough to grant us safety. It's not enough, not because you or we are doing anything wrong, but because the premise was always flawed. In the context of the United States, this type of behavior and the course of denial has always worked with siding with whiteness, something I'm so proud of our community for more readily refusing over the last decades. I won't recount the history of how siding with whiteness became regularized in the United States, but what I will highlight is the psychological impact of this, and that's part of what I want to sort of impart on us. I want to highlight that this is a wager, this is a trade-off that's created serious psychological pressure for our community, because this wager was never a fair one. It was never a fair one because it always expected us to compromise who we were before we were even allowed to engage relationally and or be accepted into humanity. It's not just about to the United States, it's about becoming human. We were expected to cut ourselves off, psychologically untether from our culture, from our race, and from our ethnicity before anything was done. And here I want to highlight, if you're wondering why the current parallel, something that's happening right now, that question, do you condemn Hamas, gets so under your skin, feels so deeply troubling, it's because it's a repetition of what has always been the starting point of any conversation for Arabs in the United States, for Arab Americans, and of course, definitely so post 9/11. This wager, of course, always also came at the expense of our Black siblings and of other immigrants who are not thought to be model minorities. This meant that we were also cutting off sustaining relationships and playing into a class struggle that erased the poor and further put pressure on our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents to make it or else be thought of as failures. This pressure has been passed along generationally, making second and third generation Swana kids feel like they can't measure up. This is the historical context in which we find ourselves in this moment. It's about Gaza currently, and also it's on the backdrop of everything that I've just named. I've had many people ask me, but why does this time feel so much worse? And while the immediate answer is because it is worse, because the atrocities that we're witnessing in Gaza and across Palestine should never be thinkable or digestible, let alone doable, it is also because there is this historical context that has been slowly chipping away at our Swana community. I will say a little more about this, and then I can pause and we'll move into the questions, and I'll have Zena sort of engage me with those. This time around feels worse because the atrocities in Gaza are happening atop a slowly growing history of violence against our community, whether that's in the United States with political repression or Islamophobia, or in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Sudan, or elsewhere in the Swana region. That is, what is happening in Gaza cannot be delinked psychologically from the impact of imperialism and of the decimation of the Middle East over the past 20 years, largely spearheaded by the United States. We are generations of people, of Swana people, that have witnessed the mass displacement of countless of our people, the dehumanization of Arabs and of Muslims, virulent Islamophobia, anti-Arab sentiment, the stripping of our civil liberties, not to mention 4 and more years of degrading and violent language on the daily by the previous president, a president that also enacted the Muslim ban. I'm not highlighting any of these things to make us more depressed or struggle more, but rather I'm saying this as an active and live modeling of what reality testing means. When we speak to these truths, when we speak to what has been called intergenerational trauma, this is what we're talking about. When we allow ourselves to name the expansive context in which our current pain is being animated through what we're seeing in Gaza, we also free ourselves up from having to find overly simplistic and unsatisfying explanations to the deep psychic pain we are all feeling. It also allows us to deepen our empathy as an entire Arab community with our Palestinian siblings, recognizing that these trade-offs that I've spoken about also came at the expense of their suffering, because the powers that ask us to wager to begin with will always hold ransom the conditions by which that wager will be accepted. This reality testing then can be our communal exercise here today, but also I hope in an ongoing way. It's one that does justice to the pain we're in, to the real symptoms we are feeling, to the new depths of heartache that seem to arise every single day, and also to the liberating and generative force of sustaining our will to live, what we see every single day in Gaza and across Palestine and as Arabs from Turtle Island to Palestine.
Dr. Lara, thank you for contextualizing our feelings and the situation, and for acknowledging the deep hurt and pain within, what everybody is going through right now together. It's important for us to hear from you, and appreciating the magnitude of the situation. A lot of the questions that we got, Dr. Lara, had to do with feeling guilty or feeling helpless. And, a question said it perfectly. How do I unplug without feeling guilty? They're not sleeping, they're not engaging with people around them. And how can we as a community unplug and be productive at the same time?
Yes. Yeah. I really appreciate this question, because I'm hearing a lot of people struggle with this. And the pull is always, I feel like I need to constantly be aware, or there are people who are struggling, and that, it ends up feeling like if I'm not struggling, then I'm leaving somebody behind, right? And I think one of the things to think about is that in acknowledging all these moving pieces, we also need to acknowledge too that the sort of guilt we're feeling, oftentimes these things that we're doing when we're engaging, let's say, in scrolling on social media, because that makes us feel like we're connected, these things are also a lot of times done in isolation, right? We're on our phones, we're sort of isolated communally. And I think one of the things that I really want to bring home to us is that being in community with each other, practicing this reality testing with each other, is actually central to allowing us to sustain the stamina for a larger fight. Part of the reason why I wanted to speak about mental health issues in a context is because many of these things are structural, right? We're seeing a peak of it right now with Gaza, and we need to acknowledge that. And we need to sort of de-individualize that. So when we're feeling guilty, we're also sort of maybe going through inside our mind. And when I hear from people, and I often ventriloquize what they say inside their heads to themselves, is some sort of version of like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get up? Why can't I just do this? Look at those folks in Gaza, they're struggling. What that does, rather than sort of allow us to like motivate ourselves out of it, is actually individualize what we're feeling. And individualizing what we're feeling actually takes away from the conditions that create that feeling to begin with, the conditions that actually create the suffering that's happening in Gaza right now, right? So part of that is speaking back to that guilt, is sort of where are the sources of that guilt, but also taking it away from the individuality of it, right? And a sort of a challenging also is that if we are not plugged in 24/7, have you forgotten what's happening? Right? Is that the only way we stay connected? And oftentimes I think what we're all feeling, and maybe you can sort of experience this too, is that there's a cycle that we're seeing over and over and over and over again of the same images of all that. These are important to witness. I don't want to take away from, because there are folks in Gaza who are telling us, please witness this, right? And also sustaining oneself to be able to witness in the ways that are long term, not just short term, right, is actually incredibly important for us. There's a version of talking to ourselves about that, though, and relocating it within the history and sort of in speaking about these things, even internally to ourselves. Like I promise you, we all do a version of this, of speak to ourselves internally. But it becomes very important to sort of push up against this helplessness, this helplessness of feeling guilty like that.
And we also spoke about the magnitude of this, and how do we control? There's this feeling of that nobody is listening. The world is not listening. Everybody's seeing these images on TV. Everybody knows what's happening on the ground, and there are no repercussions, neither for Israel or the United States or anybody who's committing these crimes against the Palestinian people. There's a sense of helplessness, but also this sense of nobody cares about us. Everybody's failed us. How do we this helplessness and rage, how do we deal with that?
Yes. Okay, so you said the buzzword, rage, right? I think a lot of folks feel very jarred by their rage, right? But what I would say to folks is that rage is sustaining. It's life affirming. It's not arbitrary rage. You're feeling rage because you should be enraged. Any of us should be enraged that we live in a world that has the conditions where something like this can happen, let alone those of us who live in the United States and know that the United States is what is sustaining and providing cover and actually actively engaging in this. That rage is not something to be worried about. It's not something that's going to lead you to do, and that is a big jump from feeling rage around issues of suffering to potentially being destructive of self-destruct is a big jump, right? So what I would say for folks, and I often say, it's what connects us to our humanity. That rage fills you up, not because it's destructive, but it's because it is tapping into something so central about the injustice of what is happening, right? Don't be afraid of it. The world around you will try to discipline it. It will promise you that if you temper yourself down, if you talk softly, if you do things in a certain way, then it will respond. But I think this is what we've been seeing, especially in Gaza, right? Is that years of nonviolent protest, of walking, still begot this genocidal response, right? And I think any sort of history of fighting against oppression has included life-sustaining rage. Now, the way that we sort of allow that rage to sort of be channeled into imagining and enacting the world we want to live in rather than destructing is doing so in community, is being out in the streets like we're doing, but also in the small things that we do, like taking care of ourselves, right? By being fueled by that, by remembering that one of the things an oppressor does is infiltrate your mind and try to strip you of your humanity. Every time you feel rage, I want you to remember that is you connecting to your humanity when an oppressor is insisting that you have none.
Wow, very true. How do we balance being caretakers for family members and elders who have their own trauma and experiences that they've faced throughout their years being Arab, being Palestinian,
Yes.
and juxtaposed with advocacy, and the need to advocate? I think it's a two-pronged question here in terms of self-care, family care, but also how do we deal with that in the larger context of advocacy?
Right. So I would say here, if we're thinking from a community building perspective and from leaning into our community, and also from, sort of, I learned from Black feminists, from our own Arab feminist sisters, and from communities that have come before us, is that being a caretaker in a family and caring for our elders is a form of advocacy in of itself. I think sometimes we're conditioned to think that advocacy looks a very particular way. I'm not downplaying how important it is, especially in moments like this, to be in the street. But what I do also want to say is that for people to be in the street at this number, at this level, so much has happened behind the scene that is also advocacy, right? From the meals that have been cooked for people, and we know this from the days of the Intifada. I've spoken with women who are part of, who were lived through the Intifada, and the most moving thing that I've heard from folks who have been part of these struggles is saying the things that happen off the scene, right? That sustain the will to live on the scene, right? And I think, what I can read into this, there might be some sort of misogynistic way of thinking about, oh, this is not oh, you're just staying at home and caretaking. And I want us to really push ourselves and be like, every person in every place is actually part of this, right? And so one is a sort of gentle reminder to ourselves that, to take care of families is also to take care of the people who, whether today or tomorrow or in the future, are the ones who are also going to be in the streets, right? And to remind ourselves that there's a spectrum, and everybody is needed. Every single person is needed, and that's what we're seeing. The fruits of that over decades of organizing are what we are seeing in the streets, and I just wouldn't downplay that at all.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that, long-term, short-term conversation, how do we approach care at the moment, given the magnitude again, and whether it's self or communal, with an eye on minimizing long-term trauma, because this will not end soon, but also when it's said and done, how do we handle the long-term drama of this?
Yes. Yeah, and some of the drama that, right, we're seeing so much of that, like the sort of responses on the level of universities, for example, are causing a lot of this. What I would say is partially go back to what I was talking about before. There are some basic things that we can do every single day to approach self-care. And sometimes we're so used to hearing these pop psychology ideas about self-care. And I also tend to stay away from sort of what I would say like capitalist prescriptions about things that are quick often don't last, right? And so I think part of it is, how do we rethink what self-care means like? And I think to take care of yourself in the moment is also to build networks that will sustain us in the long run, because we know these things are not short-term. What's happening in Gaza right now, we are seeing in real time what will later come to be known as intergenerational trauma, right? And I think all of us are going to be dealing with it. I mean, what's happening in Gaza has changed the world in many ways, right? It's opened up possibilities for things we could never have dreamt about before, but it also will have a long-lasting impact. So I think part of why I wanted to set it in a historical sense is also to say there are ways in which we can be building from now for what we know will come, right? That does mean sustaining ourselves. That does mean creating communities of care. That does mean the sort of multi-generational and multi-ethnic groups and solidarity movements we are seeing. There are this many people in the street because it's coalition building, and I don't say that in a light way. I think refocusing on our communities, whoever might be included in that, is one way of which we approach the care in the moment. But that's not just a moment thing. That is also on our eyes moving forward. And here I want to say, we also, part of the suffering that we're feeling right now, and apart from the specific context to the Swana community, I want to also remember that the COVID is not done. We lived through a global pandemic in which millions of people died, and people have not grieved that. We see the wear and tear that the lack of economy has done to people. We have a generation of folks who are not doing as well as their parents is. The first generation that wasn't like that. And for those of us who come from immigrant families, this is a different shift in things. We have climate catastrophe. Like, I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here. I'm just saying that this is all the things that we're talking about long term. Why it is that taking care of ourselves in the moment means also building ways of taking care of ourselves in the future, right? And acknowledging all these moving pieces. Because when we start to isolate them, I think that's when it starts to feel like something doesn't quite add up. It feels cheap, or it feels surface, or it doesn't really quite get at the magnitude of the suffering that we're feeling. And it certainly doesn't do anything to help us stave off sort of the future elements of trauma. The last thing I'll say is that I'm not sure there's a way to game ourselves out of the immense trauma that we're going to feel. And I think this is where embracing, what is happening, but also recognizing that there are ways of healing continuously that don't have to take on these models of trauma that have never spoken for us, that would maybe, as Samah Jabr might say, maybe focus on the post and post-traumatic trauma, where many of us don't see ourselves in that because we understand these things on an ongoing way. So even divesting from these concepts that have been told to us as like, that's the only way to know ourselves or know of our suffering, even in doing that, and I think there's a growing body of literature and there's a growing body of folks, even some of them I see in the audience today, that have been working on this, that have been speaking to this, and have been really acknowledging and validating what it means to not fit into these sort of white-centric or Eurocentric ways of thinking about trauma, even.
So we spoke a little bit about survivor's guilt, but I think it's important to dig a little deeper in this, because we're talking about the simplest things here. We're not just talking about surviving. When we see children in Gaza aren't able to eat or drink, when we see, no clothing, no basic medical care, even to the extent of, for us here, sitting down for a meal might cause us anxiety or, pain. And it's on a day-to-day basis. I know you discussed it in general, and so moving forward, but on a day-to-day basis, how can we be able to detach and be able to live your day-to-day life doing day-to-day things which are, part of the oppression of the Palestinian people that we feel guilty about? They're oppressing people in Gaza right now, and here we are in the US also feeling that same sort of, we could be in their place. Any of us could be in Gaza right now, and we are all in Gaza, heart and mind. So how do we deal with that survivor's guilt?
Yeah, it's such an important question. And like you said, I think I hear this so much. I think this is the one that I hear the most. Folks sort of reaching out and being like, Every time I eat, I feel guilty. Every time I sleep, I feel guilty. I make myself stay awake because I just can't think about. Let me answer this both on a sort of conceptual theoretical level, and then speak to the sort of basics and the necessity of this. Number one is I want us to think about the word survivor, and I want us to sort of reclaim the power of that in the context of the erasure of Palestine and Palestinians. Is survivors are those that weren't disappeared, right? And it's heavy. It's heavy to think about it like that, right? But I think when we can say it like that, there's a way in which the guilt can sort of be animated in a particular way in terms of how powerful it is to be surviving, right? And that the guilt is, on the one hand, because you recognize that suffering. This goes back to the humanity, tapping into humanity, even when every turn that the dehumanization is so overwhelming that every time you tap into, whether it's guilt or rage or all that, it's a reminder that that has not been taken away from you, right? But also you are witness, you are literally living history. If you are Palestinian and you are feeling survivor's guilt, it's because you are living history, and such an important piece as a refusal against settler colonial erasure, right? To insist that whatever the settler state will do, Palestinians will continue to exist. And there is something called Palestine. And that place is from the river to the sea in Palestine, which we all see, we all know, right? No matter how much reality bending there is. So I really don't mean that in an abstract sense. I mean that in a way, but this is one of these things about reality testing, that it takes a repetition. It takes a sort of constant coming back to it. It takes a sitting with that, holding the pain of what that means and honoring it, right? What I'll also say is what I'm in contact with folks regularly across Palestine, across Palestine, and also in Gaza. And one of the first things they say is, you not eating or not sleeping won't help us do any better. Why? Because we need folks to be full in themselves to be able to continue the fight, right? And that is very, very basic. Now, I don't want to in any way say that is easy. And I want to say and normalize that you might not be able to do everyday things. You might be feeling like, even at your best try, and even when you're thinking about this, that you're at best showing up maybe 50% of the time, 30% of the time. You feel distracted. You feel completely, spaced out, right? Dissociated from the things around you. You might feel distracted from basic conversations. I want to also normalize that, because part of the living everyday life is also struggling through the things that make everyday life, right? There's a way in which we also, because we want to be strong, there's a way in which we also don't allow ourselves to be in that struggle. If we are going to be survivors, if we are going to be the ones that carry history forward, there also needs to be an honoring of like that. That's not an easy task either.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Thank you for that. It's helpful to think about it that way and not sort of have to feel the guilt without understanding how we can utilize it to benefit both the moment and the future. So very important words. Dr. Lara, one of the most or a big group of people here in the United States that are facing serious backlash and serious attacks, but have also been on the forefront of leading protests, of leading these conversations and challenging the narrative and pushing our elected officials, but also in the grassroots and in the streets, and our students in the from K through 12 and university students. And it seems like there's a common denominator with, as we were talking in general about people feeling detached, feeling upset, and not being able to do their daily mundane even tasks. for students in particular, we've had a bunch of questions regarding how to refocus on school when you're feeling so irrelevant compared to a genocide, and how to feel motivated to focus on things that, like homework that in the grand scheme of things don't matter, an A or B or C, at this point, it doesn't matter. So what can students in particular do at this point in time to help themselves?
Yes. Okay, so first of all, I'm just some humor here is that I love that we're at the point in our community where we can be like the A, B, or C doesn't matter right now. So I just want to speak to the parents in the room that have to fight themselves about this. And it might feel like a stereotype, but we all know it. We've all been there. So I'm speaking both to the parents and the students here, and I'm speaking to students across sort of the board. And it might be a differing level of this depending on what year you're at, like if you are in high school or on, and it actually is important because I think there's a way in which we can put things in context, right? If you are a freshman in high school, it's going to be different than if you're a senior, right? Or sorry, I will say a junior, and maybe you're applying to colleges now, and that's something that so I do think there might be a difference in terms of how much pressure somebody feels, and I think we need to normalize that. And any one of these questions needs to, again, go back to context. Like, part of the reason why I wanted to contextualize is a modeling of how all the questions that we have about our mental health, we can also do a version of that, of contextualizing. And that allows us to organize what's really important right now, where's the pulse, and what do we need to pay attention to. What I would speak to all students, regardless of where you're at, and then I'll go into particulars, is right now, I think it's okay to give people permission, both in terms of parents giving students, their kids permission, but also students themselves giving themselves permission to approximate success. Right? Is like it's very unlikely that you're going to give 100%. Even if you wanted to, it's very hard to. You're seeing people around you struggle. Some people have actual family, right? In Palestine, in Gaza. If you're not Palestinian, you're seeing our Palestinian siblings struggle. It's a very hard time to be Arab in the United States, regardless. This is not siphoning off of the struggle of Palestinians, for us to also recognize that this is a communal pain. And I think that's one thing that we have seen, is that the coming together of our community to say, oh, this is why Palestine is central to all our liberation, is why we're all feeling it. So I'm speaking to all students, not just Palestinians right now, and saying it's all right not to give 100%, right? You're already doing so much. And a lot of the so much that you're doing is actually being engaged in the world, which is what we hope school and college and everything will allow you to do. So if you're practicing that in real time, these are actual skills that you're also engaging in. If you're in college, or I teach at a graduate level, I encourage my students to ask me for extensions if life happens. We're not sort of trained to think like that. We're trained to think that things are set in stone and that they're very rigid and that professors are not going to be able to move things. But there is a level of flexibility that can happen. And I would really encourage people, if you feel comfortable to do so, to be asking, this is the time to do that. This is the time to ask for extensions. This is the time to ask for a little bit more flexibility. If you're in high school or in middle school or something, having your parents be involved in that asking. I just want to normalize that that's an okay thing to do, right? Like, we often are trained because of ableism to think about accommodations as being negative, rather than like accommodations are actually the bare minimum, that structures that are meant to only work well for a certain population of people, and always for people who aren't struggling. Right? Which is like, if we put it in the context of the world, how many people can we say aren't struggling? So please do sort of use this a restructuring of how we think about accommodations. This is where I want to come back to the specificities. Some people might be listening and be like, well, I really can't afford to do that. I can't afford to do that because, let's say, folks, their family are relying on them to graduate and get a good job, and so they can't let their let their grades go, or they're a junior and they're trying to get into college, or you're trying to get a scholarship, or you are on scholarship, any one of these things. So I don't want to minimize the very real life circumstances that might make it feel hard to do this. If you are in that position, I would say prioritize, right? And I say this and it seems so simple, but when I talk to folks, I think, again, the way we sort of get trained in this world, and especially under capitalism, is like everything has to be at 100% and everything has to be perfect and everything has to be a full go. And what I would say to folks is really taking the time, whether you can do, if you can do that by yourself or with somebody else that you trust, with a friend, with a parent, with a, whoever, is sit down and think about what's the most essential thing that needs to be done, right? And what things can be flexible. What are the things that you actually can have some flexibility in, or what are the things that have to be done? An example of what has to be done are deadlines, like external deadlines that can't be shifted. This is what I mean about, like, in homework, even an exam might be flexible if you talk to a professor, if you talk to a teacher, but a deadline that a university sets for a college application, the college app is probably not going to be flexible, right? Taking your SATs at a certain time, at a time that's going to allow you to do things for the schools that still accept them or need them, then that might not be flexible. If you have a deadline at work that your boss is really going to, hold you accountable for, that would be the thing that would be prioritized. And then everything else can take a number two, right? This idea of everything being at the same level of importance, I think, is something for us to also unlearn. But it's going to take all of us reminding each other, parents also being active in this, students reminding each other about that. And one final thing I will say is that when I was younger, there was always this sense from my baba that, like, if you get into a habit of doing something, that it will be like that forever, right? So what I will say to everybody is that doing these things at a time of extreme duress, when we are witnessing the biggest atrocity in modern day time right now we're seeing, that doesn't mean that this is how you're going to approach your life forever. It really is giving yourself a little bit of grace, contextualizing it right now. And these things aren't habit forming. It's not like if you take an accommodation now that somehow for the rest of time you are going to be doing that. But also I want to speak to the ableism that's sort of like involved in that, even if it were for the rest of time. Considering the state of the world, maybe there should be more accommodations just in general, and that doesn't make you any less, committed to your craft, any less committed to you being a student, or any less committed to your profession. These are sort of like internal things we have to keep reminding ourselves, because we've been socialized so heavily not to think about it in this way.
Fantastic. I think it's really important. I'm a parent to two kids in high school. One of them is a junior, one of them is a freshman, and I'm having a hard time coping with this as well, and finding the right balance. So it's really important to be okay with being, with the situation and how they're coping. I think validating their feelings as well. I mean, they get to see things that we never had seen. I mean, I was born and raised in Palestine. I grew up in the Intifada, and I've seen my share of things, but we didn't have the internet. We didn't have things at our fingertips. And what we've seen during this genocide are things that children should not be seeing, let alone experiencing. So that whole dynamic with having children right now is extremely difficult, and I would love to discuss this more. I think this would take forever to really come to grips with as a parent, and how to handle children going through this. But shifting a little bit, Dr. Lara, for adults in the workplace, let's say, who are experiencing their own grief, but want to speak about things with their coworkers, about how they're feeling with their coworkers, about being pro-Palestinian. How do they do that without feeling like they're being sorry for themselves, or prioritizing themselves versus what's happening in Gaza? Where is that balance when somebody asks you how you're doing at work? How do you balance the answer?
Right. It's such a great answer. And I think it speaks to like a growing, and maybe this is because we live in a world that's more connected, and again, students are leading the way and sort of showing us this, right? How do you center Palestine? I see these conversations all the time happening with students and with folks more generally. So what I would say is a sort of returning back to earlier when I was sort of setting the frame for today, is that if we think about things in terms of larger structures, right, and larger logics, there's this way in which we can keep Palestine at the forefront and also understand that the same structures that would allow something like this to happen are the structures that have worked on us and created this wear and tear for a long time on each of us in different ways, right? And so speaking to how you're doing or your pain is not immediately a decentering of Palestine. To the contrary, in fact, my very dear friend and colleague in Palestine, Nadira Shadhoub-Kavrukyan, always reminds us and me that speaking to life, right, centering life and living and life making, and speaking Palestine anywhere we go is actually an act of centering Palestine. Why? Because it's so overly censored and so overly surveilled. And we see this happening at an alarming rate in the context of the United States. If it weren't so destabilizing for us to just say the word Palestine, there wouldn't be billions of dollars, put into censoring and anti-BDS work and sort of really smear campaigns against professors or against students or any one of these things. So I think in saying I'm struggling, and here's the reason why I'm struggling, right? I'm struggling because my heart is broken to think about what it is to be an Arab in the world currently. I'm heartbroken because I'm worried about my kids. That is not a decentering of Palestine. That is a recognition of what is happening in Palestine is directly related, right? It is a refusal of the delinking. One of the things that this world and oppressors and power does is try to make us feel like we're all disconnected and sort of atomized. We all just live separately. But what this has done, and what of course COVID did before and all that, is show us all the intimate ways in which we are interconnected. So I really would invite people is to say that in speaking to why this is so heartbreaking, right? To how we see ourselves in this sort of catastrophe, because we refuse to be disconnected from our siblings. As a Lebanese myself, I refuse the separation that was enforced on us by borders that are not of our making between Palestinians and Lebanese people, for example. And this is something that I regularly say, right? So I guess it's a two-part answer. Is one, really continuing to be mindful. And I love that people are sort of really thinking about this, how to not decenter. And I think one way to not decenter is just think about these as all connected and part of a structure that again creates the conditions for suffering.
Right. And we have a question actually from the audience right now, who I think is perfect for continuing on this conversation, which is, that's when you're talking to somebody who might be sympathetic or understanding. But there are a lot of people who are feeling that their community or their friends or even their family have either remained silent on the issue of genocide or not taking a stance that they would like, or are completely on the on the other side of things. So how does one reconcile, how does one deal with family members, but also, we saw this during the Trump era. I feel like a lot of people had this conversation where you're either with Trump or you're not with Trump. And if so I think in this case as well, there's clear divides in communities, with friends, with family members. And how do you suggest people handle those situations?
Yeah, this is such a difficult question, partially because I'm of those people, and I've said this publicly and I'll say it again, that the liberation of Palestine and how that ties into the pan-Arab revolution and liberation is what I would say. The liberation of all peoples that are considered, Swana, is not a side gig thing. And so I think there's some level of being ready at least in friendships, let me sort of say, is being ready to lose people, because this is not an abstract issue, right? Now, what I will say is when it comes to family, that is harder. I never want to prescribe to people like a prescription of how they should deal with things. But I do think that there's something really important about the struggle that you are feeling about that. And I think it's okay. I don't think we're going to get around that, right? I think when you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm at this point. I've had a lot of people reach out to me and be like, this person actually is not, I can't any longer be this person's friend. I can't any longer be around this person. I think there's something to be said to that. Like this is something out of what any of us could imagine. And it feels so deeply simple, right? And so I don't want people also to be shaming themselves about like, oh, is this an over exaggerated response? Or it's not. I do think there's something very simple about being like, this is genocide. And if you can't see that, there's something troubling about that, right? And from there to sort of go back to the context and like the particularities of it, just like we did with the students, is like, let's prioritize. There may be some people, because of our own communal practices, that we might not be able to completely cut out of our lives. Okay. And that might be kind of the way that we make these decisions. Are there people that you have to continue to be in community with regardless of this? I hope for many people that's not the case, but I understand that for some people it is. And if that's the case, are there a way to, to prioritize so that there's only one person like that in your world that you're kind of feel like a duty to in a familial sense? We call this wajib in Arabic, right? We have a wajib to certain. If that's the case, then you probably are not going to have much emotional space or internal fortitude to be flexible with other people, right? Because you're already taking so much of your sort of expansiveness and generosity with somebody that you have to be around because they're part of your family. So I suppose I'm just giving permission to folks. I think another one of the ways that we are socialized is like somehow holding on to relationships is representative of how good we are, or how competent we are in the world, or how mature we are, or any one of these things. I just don't ascribe to that. I think sometimes relationships end, and they end for good reason. And if being a genocide denier is one of those things, that might be a relationship worth ending at this point. For the relationships that can end, right? For the ones that are much more difficult, this is where the issue of prioritizing time, exposure to folks like this. The last thing I'll say about this is that if somebody is a genocide denier, it's very unlikely they're going to change their mind. So I would beg of us to divest from our energies going into spaces to talk across the aisle, to try and bring people in, apart from the normalization that talks about, right? We're sort of normalizing with folks that are genocide deniers or Nakba deniers or whatever the case that is that we really know psychologically that that's actually not what happened. There might be people that will be able to move that person along. It's very unlikely that you're going to be the person to move that person along, right? And so this might get back to how do we engage in self-care, is really not engage with people who would ask you to deny your humanity as a precursor to even talking to them, right?
Yeah. Another really difficult question, Dr. Lara, is, and I've faced that, we all face this, not just Palestinians, but Arab Americans and non-Arab Americans. I mean, everybody is facing this. When you have friends or who have family in Gaza, and you're constantly hearing that they've been killed. And I can't tell you how many times I've given condolences, and it seems so inadequate. And it's not, I mean, I'm a lot of us in the community have done this both in a professional sense, but also in a very personal way. I am afraid that the amount of condolences that we've given in the past 35 days, 37 days, have become so normal that we say, عظم الله أجركم, or, يسلم راسكم, or Allah يصبركم. How two questions here. How do we not desensitize to these words and hold them true to what they mean inside what we mean them inside? And number two, how do we deal with this as far as relating to our friends? Because you want to be comforting, but you also don't want to be over, you know, you're there constantly. You want to be supportive, but not in their face, if you will.
Yes.
And it's becoming more and more difficult because more and more of our friends are losing family members. So what is the best way to talk to our friends when
it's such a difficult question, right? And I think that's part of why you're asking it, because we're all sort of left with, it feels inadequate because it is, right? Because all of us have to contend with the fact that this is even happening. It shouldn't even be happening, right? And I think there's something really important in that, and that might get to the question of what you're saying about the desensitization, is that part of what happens is the more time that goes on, the further away we are from that pulse about how utterly unspeakable this is, and that there under no circumstance should this be happening, period, right? And the longer the time goes, the further away we get from that. So I'd like to say that, like, if there's a way in which we can repeat that and stay connected to that knowledge, that under no circumstance should this be happening, period, that it sort of does buffer us against desensitization. What I will say is that, you know, here I will also, and then I'll go into like what you might be able to say, that's again not prescriptive, but just my own experience with folks and talking to people about what is helpful, what's not helpful, is that we also learn sort of from like our Black siblings in this country, and of course our Indigenous siblings. But part of the reason why people say their name is because it's so easy for people to become statistics. And actually becoming statistics is part of the psychological warfare and the physical warfare, where people sort of blend in, and then their entire, that they are a person with a history, with a fullness to them, disappears also with that, right? And so I think there's something important about the witnessing, the speaking of the name, right, of the people, of taking that moment of silence. Some of these things might feel like, oh, they might be performative, or they're just like a placeholder, but they're not. Those are the moments of contemplation where internally we can remember that these are full people whose lives were taken from them under circumstances that should have never happened, right? That fullness is really important to come back to, because so we don't flatten who these folks are. And this might go back to like, what are we able to say to our friends and our family, and the growing list of folks that are, you know, that are in deep grief, and grief that, you know, might feel suspended or never actualized, because, you know, we also need to acknowledge that burial rites are not being given right now. And I think the idea of also tradition or repetition or sort of ceremonies in that way are actually part of a way that grief is processed, and processed communally, right? So I think also asking ourselves, are there ways in which we can extend that that courtesy, that grace, that sort of being present in the honoring of the dead in ways that might not be able to be done materially, right? What I do with my friends, whether in Gaza or across Palestine, is truly just send love and let them know they're on my mind all the time. And it's not an expectation of getting anything back. It's not extractive in terms of you know, wanting to know all the details. I think this is sometimes we ask those questions out of love, but it might feel intrusive, like you're saying, but more so because maybe this goes back to the other question of like seeing that the world doesn't care. One of the ways that oppression works, and especially in conditions like this, is that oppressors make people believe that they're alone and that everybody's forgotten them, right? And that is part of what penetrates the mind. And so if folks are constantly know they are being held in mind, I don't think anybody in Gaza is asking us to sort of solve their grief. What they're asking us to do is solve the conditions that created this suffering to begin with. And that is something that we need to take up, right? But sort of just communicating, we are holding your mind. We have not forgotten. We've not lost stamina in terms of paying attention. We will say every single name, right? We will pray for every single person that is martyred. We will sort of talk about these things. We will not shy away from calling people martyrs. We will not shy away from saying what it truly is. We will not shy away from witnessing what this means. I think that goes a long way, and people really are saying that it does make a difference to tell them we're holding you in mind.
Amazing. There's a very powerful clip, I think, somewhere on the internet where they're like, don't send us water. We don't want water. We don't want food. Just keep talking about Palestine.
Yes.
Keep talking about us. Don't forget us.
That's right.
It's extremely powerful to watch. And Dr. Lara, there's a few questions in the chat, but also it came in beforehand. But how do you, as Arab therapists, not go mad in a country, in this country right now? How do you handle the situation? You have I mean, we have over 100 people on this, if not more, and everybody needs to hear from somebody they can relate to and who understands.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what do you all do to help each other and yourselves during this difficult time? And I think go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll speak for myself, and then I'll sort of talk about what we do in community with each other, is that being engaged helps, right? I would rather be exhausted at the end of the day, because that exhaustion feels different when I feel engaged and aligned with my political commitments to the world, which also are my ethical commitments as a clinician, right? Being disconnected from that actually feels a lot worse. It feels worse to not be engaged. So I think sometimes people, will be like, you have your teta in your head or your mama or something that are like, you said, like, take a break, take this or anything. And I really appreciate that, because they're showing care. And also, I think that type of break, and I'm not saying I do engage in self-care, my partner is a central part of that. We do sit down, especially in the morning, and have breakfast and process things together. Creating a routine for yourself, whatever nourishes you, is really important, and nothing is too small to be that, right? That is what sustains me. Knowing I have that at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day is very sustaining for me. Having friends and comrades, just as I was saying, like, people, keeping people in mind, getting text messages throughout the day or emails saying, I'm thinking about you, or is there anything I can do? Or one of the things we do for each other is like some of the basic, some of the things that I might be good at that other people aren't good at. Like, for some reason in this world, I've been given the skill of filling out forms, filling out things, right? This is something that comes easy to me. Other people find it an awful task. And I recognize all of you that do that. And I'm saying this partially in a humor way, but partially also to know people intimately enough to know the things that we can take off their shoulders, and also understand that in building community, the communities we have built are those that also will give back to us in the ways that we need when we need it. Right. And I think this is what we're doing really right now. There are growing communities of clinicians who refuse this line that somehow being neutral is an option. I've heard from countless people in therapy, patients, who have said that their therapist either fights them on this, actually actively tells them, well, what about Hamas? Right? Or refuses to say anything about it, or polices them and says, this is political, so I can't go there, or whatever version of this. And what I will tell you is that if that is the situation you find yourself in, there are other people who don't practice this way. Then that person might sell you a version that this is how all therapy is, and it's just actually not true. There are a growing number of folks, I know you all are highlighting on the ADC Instagram page, if folks want to follow that, right? Like Swana therapists, and there's a BIPOC Analysis Collective, and there are many collectives that are out there right now. There's IDA, and there's all these people who work in both abolition, a recognition of the wrecking effects of capitalism, a recognition of settler colonialism, the centrality of Palestine to our work, because we recognize that if we're not taking seriously the suffering of all people, and especially the folks who are the most oppressed, then we're not really attending to the ethics of our job. And I just kind of want to sort of name that's part of also how we stay sane, is that we remind ourselves of that and each other of that.
Dr. Lara, thank you so much for answering some of these questions. I mean, we've had so many, and we are thinking of everybody who's watching this. We hope this has been helpful. Before we come to an end, I would love if you can give us tips for anxiety control and regulating our breathing. I know these are concrete steps that we had, skills we had talked about before. I'm going to give you your space to give your closing, please. And then we will go ahead and give our final remarks after.
Sure. So there's one thing that folks often ask me, like, what is it that I can immediately do? And what I will say as a disclaimer is that, prescribing breathe, sometimes people will roll their eyes or feel really offended if somebody prescribes breathing to them. And I understand why that's the case, because breathing is not going to stop what is happening in Gaza. But what I will say to you is a sort of kind of like the working mechanics of it internally, is that many of us are feeling incredibly anxious all the time. That can feel like many different things, the distraction we feel, or our heart palpitations, or sweaty palms, or not being able to sleep, or oversleeping, or any one of these things. And I think one of the first things that disappears when we're feeling afraid or feeling anxious is the ability to breathe fully. And when we're breathing fully, that gives us the space to remember some of these things that we're talking about, right? Because our brain shuts down when we're feeling afraid and feeling anxious. So even just something as what we would call 4-4-8 breathing, right? And this is something that I do with folks who are in the middle of feeling completely overwhelmed. And I would guide them to say, you take a deep breath in to the count of 4, right? You hold your breath for the count of 4. And then you release it to the count of 8. And again, while I want to say that in and of itself won't fix something, it gives you a little bit of psychic space. It allows some of these muscles, your jaw muscles, your shoulder muscles, your back muscles, to relax just a little bit. And when that relaxes, these bigger ideas, not blaming yourself, not individualizing the pain, remembering the larger structure, remembering that rage is life-sustaining, remembering that our communities give us everything we nourish, remembering that being a survivor means that you are speaking and living history, remembering that prioritizing things is sometimes all those things have a space to exist when we're able to give ourselves just a little bit of space.
Amazing, Dr. Lara. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to, thank the team behind the scenes. Dr. Lara, do you want to give any more comments, or should we move on to our next steps? Because I think you have been an incredible presence amidst us tonight, and it's been so helpful for me personally, but I know for a lot of people who are listening, both in terms of actual practical skills to imply when we are feeling those feelings, but also in contextualizing and thinking of the issue in a larger context that would benefit all of us. So As far as ADC is concerned, thank you so much for everybody for joining this. We will be having more on mental health, and hopefully next time, once we finalize everything, we will inform all of you, but it will be from experts in Gaza on mental health, currently in Gaza on mental health. That's what's in the works. And this will be hopefully this week, and we will send you all information on that. Please remember to support ADC's work if you can. We do have an emergency fund that we are using to help with legal aspects for students on campuses, but also for the community, and to continue to hold webinars like this and others as well. So thank you for joining us, and let's keep Palestine and the Palestinian people in our hearts and our minds, and do everything we can to uplift and speak up until liberation. Thanks, y'all.